The forest had always been a place of mystery for Abby. As a child, she had ventured into the woods near her house, playing hide-and-seek among the towering pines, the scent of damp earth and pine needles filling her senses. But now, years later, standing at the edge of the same woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The trees no longer whispered in the wind, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if the forest was waiting for something or someone. Abby had been an avid hiker in her youth, but something about this trip felt different. She had come back to the woods to seek solitude after the chaos of her recent divorce, hoping that the familiar comfort of nature would offer her a break from the weight of her thoughts. Yet, as she stepped deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, heavier, as if the trees themselves were closing in on her. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself it was just her imagination running wild. The thought of the divorce and the mounting pressure of her career had kept her up many nights, her mind unraveling like a spool of thread. Abby needed this break, and she wouldn't let herself succumb to fear. But as the hours passed and the sky darkened, a strange unease began to creep over her. She had set up camp near an old weathered cabin she had stumbled upon during her hike, its once painted wood now faded and cracked. The place was abandoned, and that in itself wasn't unusual. Many of the old hunting cabins in the area had been left to rot after the logging industry had moved on. Still, something about it felt wrong. By the time nightfall had completely enveloped the forest, Abby had built a fire, its orange glow flickering in the darkness. She sat near it, listening to the chirping of crickets and the distant rustling of leaves. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. A low hum seemed to vibrate in the air, just beneath the surface of the forest's usual sounds. It was subtle at first, almost inaudible, but it grew louder as the night wore on. Abby frowned, standing up and scanning the surroundings. There were no animals in sight, and the rustling noises from earlier had ceased. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound confident. There was no answer. The hum, however, was unmistakable now, coming from deep within the woods. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't the wind. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, followed by a strange scraping sound, as if something large and heavy were dragging along the ground. Abby's heart pounded in her chest. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes darted across the darkened landscape, searching for the source. She told herself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but deep down she knew it wasn't. It was something else, something far more unsettling. Abby's pulse raced as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was unmistakable now, the dragging noise, like something large and cumbersome moving through the underbrush. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as the shadows around her seemed to deepen. Every instinct told her to run, but she remained frozen, her gaze fixed on the dark tree line, her muscles locked in place. The fire crackled, its flames dancing wildly, casting eerie, elongated shadows on the cabin's weathered walls. But the warmth of the flames did nothing to calm the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She reached for the flashlight in her backpack, her hands trembling as she clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, but it revealed nothing. No movement, no animals. Just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, as though they were unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond their reach. "Come on, Abby," she muttered to herself. "Get a grip." She took a deep breath and forced herself to step toward the sound, hoping that whatever it was just a figment of her imagination. But as she moved closer to the woods, the dragging sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. Stood there for a long moment, her heartbeat thumping in her ears before she finally exhaled. But then, she heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but unmistakable. It came from the cabin. "Help!" Abby froze, the blood draining from her face. The voice was weak, strained, as though someone were calling out from behind a wall. She quickly spun around, searching the darkened windows of the cabin for any signs of movement. There was nothing. No figure, no shape, no light. Yet the voice lingered in the air, growing fainter by the second. "Help!" Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a moment, Abby stood paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The voice was faint, but it sounded so real, so desperate. Swallowing her fear, she took a hesitant step toward the cabin. Her footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of leaves beneath her boots, but they seemed too loud in the oppressive silence of the night. She reached for the door handle, which was cold to the touch, and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the pitch-black interior. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with the scent of decay. Abby's flashlight illuminated old furniture, the remnants of a life long abandoned, but it cast no light on the source of the voice. "Hello?" Abby called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, only the rustling of leaves outside, the wind gently swaying the branches. She stepped inside cautiously, her flashlight shaking in her grip. Her breath was shallow, her senses heightened. She could feel something watching her, something waiting. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and every fiber of her being screamed at her to leave. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the voice, whatever it was meant for her. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, with a force that sent Abby stumbling forward. She spun around in panic, but the darkness in the cabin was complete, unnaturally so. Her flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering in and out. She turned it off and on again, but the light refused to stay steady. A cold, guttural laugh echoed through the cabin. It was low and ominous, reverberating off the walls as if it were coming from everywhere at once. Abby's breath caught in her throat as the laugh echoed around her, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't human. It was something else, something that shouldn't be in this world. She spun in place, trying to locate the source of the laughter, but the darkness seemed to close in on her, consuming everything. Her flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows across the cabin's interior. "Who's there?" Abby called out, her voice trembling more than she intended. Her heart raced in her chest, and she tried to force herself to calm down, but her mind was a whirl of panic and confusion. The door had slammed shut on its own, and now this laughter, this unnatural mocking sound, it couldn't be a coincidence. She was no longer alone. From the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. A figure, tall and thin, seemed to be creeping along the walls, its movements unnatural, jerky, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tightly. Abby's breath hitched. She was sure she hadn't seen it before, and yet it was right there, lurking just beyond her sight. "Show yourself," she demanded, her voice shaking. But the figure only laughed again, a twisted sound that rattled her to the core. Abby instinctively backed away, her eyes darting around the cabin in search of an escape. Suddenly, the beam of her flashlight caught something on the wall, a small crack, barely noticeable at first glance. But as she stepped closer, the crack widened, revealing something far darker lurking behind the wooden planks. Abby froze, her heart pounding in her chest. A pair of eyes stared back at her. The eyes were wide and unblinking, set deep within a face that seemed to distort and shift like liquid. It was as if the wall itself had come alive, and the creature was trying to break free. Abby's stomach twisted, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But the eyes, those eyes, they were real. And they were watching her. "Help!" The voice whispered again, this time much clearer, coming from behind the wall, from those unblinking eyes. Abby felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt heavy, suffocating, as if the very air around her was being stolen away. The eyes blinked, and in that brief moment, the rest of the face emerged. A gaunt, skeletal figure with skin stretched too tight across its bones, the color of dried ash. Its mouth opened, revealing jagged teeth that seemed too large for its thin, bony frame. The thing from behind the wall, it wasn't human. It wasn't anything she had ever seen before. Abby stumbled backward, her mind reeling in terror. She turned to run, but the door wouldn't open. She pushed and pulled at the handle, her fingers slick with sweat, but the door remained stubbornly closed. The thing behind the wall wasn't the only thing in the cabin anymore. It was in the walls, the floor, the ceiling, its presence filling every inch of the room. A low growl rumbled from deep within the floorboards, sending a violent shudder through Abby's body. The growl rose into a cacophony of sounds, whispers, scratching, tapping, like hundreds of voices calling to her from every direction. Help. The voice was everywhere now, coming from inside her own mind, wrapping itself around her thoughts, making them tremble with fear. Abby's mind struggled to break free. But she couldn't escape. She was trapped. With a final scream of desperation, she slammed her shoulder against the door, throwing herself against it with all her might. It creaked, and then, finally, it gave way, swinging open into the cold night air. Abby didn't hesitate. She bolted out into the forest, her breath ragged, her heart thudding in her chest. The darkness behind her seemed to stretch and twist, as if it were alive, following her every step. The laughter, the whispers, the growling, it all merged into one horrific symphony that clawed at her ears as she ran. But then, just as she thought she had escaped, she heard it. A voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Help me." Abby didn't look back. Her legs burned with exhaustion as she stumbled through the underbrush, the forest seeming to close in on her from all sides. The whispering voices, the growling, the unearthly laughter, they had all faded, but the sense of something watching, waiting, followed her relentlessly. She pushed through the trees, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The cold, damp air cut through her like a blade, but it was nothing compared to the chill deep in her bones. She couldn't shake the image of those eyes, those dark, hollow eyes that had stared at her from the wall. She could still feel them on her, burning into her thoughts, twisting her sanity. "Help me." The voice again. It was faint, distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. Abby stopped dead in her tracks, her pulse pounding in her ears. She looked around, but the forest was as silent as it had been before. No shadows shifted in the trees. No figures loomed in the dark. And yet, the voice that had come from nowhere and everywhere, was still there. Her mind raced. Was it real? Or was she losing her grip on reality? The ground beneath her feet suddenly gave way, and she stumbled forward, falling to the dirt. Pain shot through her knees and palms, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her body screamed for rest, for relief, but her mind was too tangled in fear, too twisted by what she had seen. The voice was calling her again. Not from behind her, not from the forest. No, it was coming from the ground beneath her. Abby froze, her heart threatening to leap out of her chest. She slowly reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the earth. And then, just as she feared, a small crack in the soil opened before her eyes, wide enough to swallow her whole. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't pleading. It wasn't a whisper, it was a command. "Come, closer." Abby's mind was a blur of confusion and fear, but one thought stood out clearer than the rest. She had to escape. She had to get away from this place, away from whatever had followed her into the night. But the voice, that strange, hypnotic voice, held her in place. Her body seemed to betray her as she found herself crawling toward the crack in the ground. "Don't listen to it, Abby." A new voice. A familiar one. She whipped around, her heart leaping as she saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, bathed in the moonlight. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with wild eyes and a rough, weathered face. Her brother Sam. "Sam?" Abby gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She felt a wave of relief followed by confusion. What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," Sam said, his voice urgent. He took a few steps forward, but then stopped, his gaze falling on the crack in the ground. His face paled. "You have to get out of here, now. It's not real." Abby blinked, her mind struggling to process the scene before her. "What's not real?" "That thing in the woods," Sam said, his voice shaking. "I've been hearing it too, the voices, the things behind the walls. We shouldn't be here." Before Abby could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled, a deep, guttural growl rising from the earth. The crack widened, and from it a shadow, dark and formless, began to emerge. Abby's pulse skyrocketed, her body freezing in terror as the thing from the wall, from the cabin, rose from the earth itself. The thing had no shape. No solid form. It was a mass of shadow, tendrils of darkness writhing as if alive, slithering toward them like a serpent hungry for prey. Abby's breath caught in her throat as she watched it grow, its shape twisting, pulsating with an unnatural energy. "We have to go," Sam yelled, grabbing Abby's arm and pulling her away from the crack in the ground. But the thing was too fast. It surged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. With a final scream of desperation, Abby tore herself free from Sam's grip, running toward the only thing that could offer her escape: the cabin. She didn't know why, but something in her gut told her that the cabin, whatever it had once been, held the key to breaking whatever was tormenting them. She burst through the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, The cabin was empty. Empty of life, but not of its horrors. The walls groaned as if alive, the shadows inside seeming to pulse with dark energy. And then, Abby realized it. The cabin wasn't just haunted by the thing that had been following her. It was the source, the place where the thing had been born. With no other choice, Abby ran to the center of the room, her hands shaking as she reached for the floorboards. She tore at the planks, frantic, desperate to find what was buried beneath, and there, in the dirt, she found it. An old, rusted key, its metal worn and bent. She didn't know what it unlocked, but she didn't care. "Abby, no!" Sam cried from the doorway, but it was too late. The shadow was already closing in, its form surging forward, swallowing everything in its path. In that final, terrifying moment, Abby realized that the key she had found was not just to a door, it was to freedom. The forest fell silent once again. Mara Walker had never been the type to shy away from challenges. As a seasoned park ranger, she'd spent years exploring the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, finding solace among the towering pines and the sound of distant rivers. But nothing had prepared her for what awaited in the remote stretch of land known as the Hollow Pines Wilderness. Few dared to venture into the heart of it, and even fewer returned with coherent accounts of their experiences. She had arrived at the ranger station the day before, prepared to begin a routine patrol. The station, an old, creaky building that had seen better days, stood at the edge of the wilderness, surrounded by fog and the eerie stillness of the forest. Something about it felt wrong, but Mara brushed off the sensation. After all, she was experienced. Nature didn't scare her, at least it didn't used to. Her first day had been uneventful. She spent the morning checking trails and marking off areas that had been damaged by recent storms. By the afternoon, the air had grown heavy with an unnatural stillness. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind, which usually rustled the trees, had fallen completely silent. As the hours dragged on, the growing sense of isolation settled deeper in her bones. Mara wasn't the type to be easily unnerved, but something about the hollow pines felt different. The trees seemed unnervingly close, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, creating shadows that stretched unnaturally long. As dusk approached, she made her way back to the ranger station, a faint sense of urgency quickening her steps. The woods had a way of consuming time, and she wanted to be inside before the darkness fully claimed the land. Just as she was about to enter the station, she heard a rustling in the brush. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the wind catching a loose leaf. But then it grew louder, more deliberate. Someone or something was moving through the underbrush. Mara froze, her instincts sharpening. This wasn't the usual wildlife. She had learned to recognize the signs of deer or raccoons, but this was different. The noise came in steady, rhythmic intervals, as if something large was pacing just beyond her sight. "Hello," Mara called out cautiously, her voice louder than she intended. No response. The rustling stopped. A chill crept down her spine as she glanced around. The forest was silent again, but the air felt thick, as if something was watching her. She waited a beat longer before slipping into the safety of the station, locking the door behind her with a shaky breath. Inside, she tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled into her chest. "It's just the woods," she muttered to herself. "Wildlife. Maybe a bear or a person lost in the trails." But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The Hollow Pines had a reputation, a dark, twisted reputation. Locals spoke of strange happenings, of people who ventured in and never returned. Some said it was the land itself, cursed by an ancient evil. Mara scoffed at the rumors, until now. Mara tried to push the unease from her mind as the night settled over the ranger station. She'd been alone before, many times, but tonight the silence seemed oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The wind had picked up again, but it sounded strange, almost purposeful. A steady whisper that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves. This wind seemed to speak, though the words were unintelligible. The moon, a pale crescent, barely pierced the heavy canopy of trees outside. Shadows shifted, dancing along the edges of her cabin, mocking her sense of security. Mara found herself pacing restlessly around the small kitchen, her mind racing. She had heard the stories about the hollow pines, the eerie disappearances, the unexplained phenomena, but she had dismissed them as local folklore, until now. When she turned off the light and crawled into bed, trying to convince herself to sleep, she thought she heard something outside again, soft footsteps, as if someone was circling the cabin. Her heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a bear. The rhythm was too deliberate, too human. She held her breath, listening for any further sound. Nothing. But then the door handle rattled. Mara shot up from the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped quietly toward the door, her mind racing with possible explanations. A prank? Someone lost? She tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than a passerby, perhaps another ranger, but deep inside, she knew better. She knew something was out there, something she couldn't explain. The rattling stopped abruptly. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Mara opened the door cautiously, her flashlight sweeping over the forest floor. Nothing. Just the dark trees, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal hands toward the sky. But the air felt wrong, charged, thick with a palpable energy that made her skin prickle. As she scanned the area, her flashlight caught something glimmering in the distance. A faint, almost ethereal glow that pulsed and flickered like a distant firefly. Her breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what it was, but something inside her, some primal instinct, told her not to approach it. Yet, despite the overwhelming sense of danger, she found her legs moving on their own, carrying her toward the source of the light. The closer she got, the stronger the sensation became, like an invisible force was pulling her in. The glow turned out to be a strange, bioluminescent fungus growing on the rotting trunks of trees. It wasn't natural, though. The mushrooms pulsed rhythmically, and as she reached out to touch one, a jolt of electricity shot through her fingers. She yanked her hand back in shock, but the glow didn't fade. Instead, it intensified, casting an eerie light across the clearing. As she stared at the glowing fungus, a cold wind stirred and she heard something, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the trees or the wind. It was coming from the ground, as though the earth itself was speaking. "Leave? Before it's too late." Mara's blood ran cold. The voice was low, guttural, filled with ancient warning. She stumbled backward, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. Had she imagined it? Was she losing her mind out here, alone in the woods? But then she saw it. Movement in the distance. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing just beyond the tree line. Mara's breath caught in her throat as the figure began to move toward her, slow and deliberate. Her legs froze in place, unable to tear her away. The figure's face was hidden in shadow, but she could feel its eyes, burning into her with an intensity that sent waves of dread crashing over her. She turned and fled. The crackling leaves beneath her boots, the only sound in the otherwise silent woods. Her heart hammered in her chest as she ran back toward the station, the feeling of being chased growing stronger with every step. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. But the sensation of being watched never left her. When she finally reached the safety of the ranger station, Mara slammed the door shut behind her, her breath ragged. She leaned against it, her hands shaking. There was no explanation for what she had seen, no rational reason for the fear that gripped her chest. But one thing was clear. Whatever haunted these woods was not just a story. It was real, and it was waiting. Mara didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of wind in the trees, kept her wide-eyed and alert, her mind replaying the events of the evening, the glowing mushrooms, the whispering voice, the shadowy figure. She had to make sense of it all. But deep down, Mara knew that there was no explanation that could make it easier to understand. The Hollow Pines was no ordinary wilderness. It was something else entirely, something ancient and unfathomable. The next morning, when the pale light of dawn filtered weakly through the trees, she found herself outside again, her resolve hardening like the ice that coated the ground. She couldn't just sit back and let fear dictate her actions. She was a ranger. This was her job, and she would not let the woods defeat her. With a steady breath, Mara packed her gear and set off toward the location where she had encountered the strange fungi. She had to know what it was, why it existed here, and what it had to do with the whispered warnings. Every step felt heavier than the last, but she pressed on, determined to find answers. The deeper she ventured into the hollow pines, the more oppressive the forest became. The trees, now twisted into grotesque shapes, seemed to close in around her. The air grew thick with a damp, earthy scent, and the shadows stretched unnaturally, like the forest itself was alive. She had heard the stories of people who wandered too far into the wilderness, losing themselves to the haunting beauty and its sinister influence. But Mara had always dismissed them. Until now. As she approached the clearing where the mushrooms had been, her heart sank. The area was empty. The glowing fungi were gone, replaced by nothing but rotting trees and dead foliage. There was no trace of the bioluminescent glow, no sign of the unnatural phenomenon that had drawn her in the night before. It was as though it had never existed. Was it just a hallucination? She muttered to herself. But she knew it wasn't. The voice, the presence, it had been real. She was certain of that now. But what did it all mean? What was the purpose behind the haunting whispers, the strange fungi, and the figure in the shadows? Her thoughts were interrupted by a low rumble, distant but unmistakable. A storm. The sky had darkened, the clouds swelling with the promise of something fierce. But before she could make her decision to head back to the station, something stopped her. A sound, faint at first, like a soft whimper, then louder, like the low growl of an animal in pain. Mara froze. She had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that animals in distress often meant trouble, predators, injuries, or territorial threats. But this wasn't the sound of any animal she recognized. It was human, the sound of someone crying. Without thinking, she followed the noise, the need to help driving her forward despite the warning bells going off in her mind. As she approached a thicket of dense underbrush, the air grew colder, and the light around her seemed to dim, as though the very forest was closing off her escape. She pushed through the brush, her heart thudding in her chest, and found herself in a small, secluded glade. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. It was hunched over, its face hidden in its hands, weeping in sorrow. Mara's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't the shadowy figure from the night before, but something else, something familiar yet foreign. The figure's ragged clothing was torn and stained, as though it had been here for a long time, wandering in the wilderness, lost. "Hello?" Mara called out hesitantly, her voice trembling. Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. It just wept, the sound echoing in the quiet forest like a cry for help. Something was terribly wrong, and as Mara stepped closer, she felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The air seemed to crackle with a dark energy, and a voice, low, almost a growl, whispered in her ear. "She's not who she seems." The voice was not the same as before. It wasn't the whispering earth, but something colder, more sinister. Before Mara could react, the figure slowly turned its head, revealing its face, pale, gaunt, and twisted with a grotesque smile that made her blood run cold. The eyes were hollow, devoid of life, and yet they locked onto her with a hunger that chilled her to the bone. And then the figure spoke, its voice a rasping hiss. "You shouldn't have come here." Suddenly the ground beneath Mara's feet gave way, and she tumbled into the darkness below, her scream lost in the void. Mara's world spun wildly as she fell, the darkness swallowing her whole. Her body slammed against jagged rocks and branches, tearing at her skin, but she barely felt the pain. Fear and adrenaline coursed through her veins, drowning out everything but the overwhelming sense of terror. The fall seemed to stretch on forever, but when she finally hit the ground, it was soft, too soft, like she was sinking into something alive. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, and pushed herself upright, scrambling away from the unknown surface that had caught her. She stood in the dark, disoriented, her flashlight flickering in her trembling hand. The beam swept across the surroundings, revealing nothing but shadows. Shadows that seemed to move and twist as though they had a life of their own. The air was thick with moisture, and the smell was nauseating. Decay, rot, and something else. Something metallic, almost like blood. She staggered forward, her legs unsteady beneath her, and found herself standing at the edge of a vast, cavernous expanse. It was a pit, a deep, unnatural hole in the earth, surrounded by twisted trees whose gnarled roots seemed to creep into the dark abyss. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked down into the chasm. At the bottom, far below, There was a faint light, a glowing greenish hue that pulsed and flickered. It was the same bioluminescent glow that had drawn her to the fungi before. But now, it was much stronger, much closer, and it seemed to call to her, beckoning her to step forward. Mara felt a tremor in the pit of her stomach. She knew she shouldn't go near it, but something inside her, some primal instinct, urged her to investigate. Her mind screamed for her to turn around, to escape, but her body took another step toward the edge of the pit. It was then that she heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from behind her. She whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. The figure. It was there again, standing just at the edge of the shadows, its face still hidden in the darkness, its eyes glowing with that same unnatural light. "No," Mara whispered, backing away. "No more, stay away from me." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her with an intensity that paralyzed her. Her breath quickened, and her pulse raced in her ears. The air around her seemed to grow colder, suffocating her, pushing her closer to the edge. The whispers, too, returned, low, guttural voices that filled her mind, telling her things she couldn't understand, things she didn't want to know. "You are already here," the voice from the figure rasped. "You have already stepped into it." Mara's head spun. What did it mean? What had she stepped into? The chasm, the glowing fungus, the figure, none of it made sense. But in that moment, she realized it didn't have to make sense. This wasn't just a wilderness. It was something far older, far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. It was a place that twisted reality itself, a place where the rules of nature no longer applied. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and the air vibrated with a low hum, as though the earth itself was alive, awakening. The glowing light from the pit grew brighter, more intense, and for a brief moment Mara saw something in the depths below. It wasn't just the light, it was shapes, shadowy figures writhing in the darkness, eyes glaring up at her, reaching for her. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the tremors ceased. The pit fell silent, and the glow faded into a soft, almost mournful flicker. The figure in the shadows took a step forward, its form sharpening, becoming more distinct. For the first time, Mara saw its face clearly, horribly clearly. It was her face, twisted and decayed, eyes hollow and filled with despair. "Leave now," the figure said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "Or become one of us." Mara's breath caught in her throat, her vision blurring. She turned and ran, her legs burning as she scrambled through the darkness, not caring where she was going, just needing to escape. The air was thick, almost suffocating, but she pushed forward, desperate to reach the surface, to escape whatever nightmare she had wandered into. As she ran, she heard footsteps behind her, but this time they weren't the slow, deliberate steps of the figure. These were faster, more chaotic, like something was chasing her. Mara's heart hammered in her chest as she burst from the thicket and into the open air, gasping for breath. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows over the forest. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had to get out, had to get away from whatever had taken hold of this place. But as she stumbled back toward the ranger station, she realized the truth. The Hollow Pines wilderness wasn't just haunted by ancient forces. It had claimed her, and it would never let her leave. The wind whispered through the trees like a distant, sorrowful voice, weaving a sense of unease into the dense undergrowth of the forest. The night air was crisp and biting, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig underfoot, seemed amplified in the silence that enveloped James as he trudged deeper into the woods. He had always thought of himself as a seasoned hiker, someone who could conquer even the wildest, most treacherous trails. But this night, he felt something was wrong. The forest was unnervingly quiet. The usual chorus of nocturnal creatures, the hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, had fallen completely silent. James tried to shake off the creeping feeling that someone or something was watching him. He adjusted his backpack, glancing at his flashlight's beam as it cut through the darkness ahead. The narrow trail wound around jagged rocks and twisted roots, each step growing heavier as though the earth itself was reluctant to let him pass. A soft, distant sound made him freeze in his tracks. It wasn't an animal's cry or the wind. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, as though someone was moving just out of sight. James turned, his heart racing. He was alone. He was certain of it. But the sound continued, each step echoing through the forest with an eerie precision. He squinted into the dark, willing his eyes to adjust, but there was nothing. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees now towering overhead like dark sentinels. Shaking his head, James forced himself to continue. The trail was becoming steeper, the underbrush thicker. He had planned this hike as a solo retreat, a way to clear his mind after weeks of stress at work. But now, it felt more like a mistake. The air was growing colder, a chill that sank deep into his bones. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he ignored it. He needed to push forward. He couldn't afford to be afraid, not now. As he pressed on, the forest seemed to shift. The trees, once familiar in their twisted, gnarled shapes, now took on grotesque forms. They loomed like dark figures, their branches reaching out as if trying to grab him. James felt his breath quicken, his skin prickling with a sensation he couldn't explain. He had been on countless trails before, but none had ever felt like this. This oppressive, suffocating atmosphere that seemed to cling to him. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the air. It was unlike anything James had ever heard. His blood ran cold as the sound seemed to come from every direction at once, surrounding him in the deep, inescapable darkness. He stopped dead in his tracks, every muscle tensed. Was it an animal or something else, something far more sinister? His mind raced, trying to rationalize the sound, but every explanation felt more absurd than the last. It wasn't until the ground beneath his feet began to tremble slightly that he realized the danger was not far off. He needed to move. But his legs felt heavy, frozen in place by the terror creeping up his spine. James finally forced himself to move, his legs shaking as he took cautious steps down the path, every creaking branch and whisper of the wind sending chills down his spine. The growl had stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening, like the calm before a storm. His breath came in shallow gasps, and every step felt like it could be his last. He was hyper-aware of the world around him now, the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. The trees seemed to lean closer, their bark twisted in unnatural ways, their shadows stretching long across the trail. There was something out there, something that didn't belong in this quiet forest. James felt it in his bones. He was no longer sure if it was just his mind playing tricks on him or if the wilderness truly harbored something sinister, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His thoughts raced, his mind searching for rational explanations. Maybe he was just overtired. Maybe it was the isolation playing tricks on him. He had read about such things before. Hikers who succumbed to the psychological effects of being alone in the wilderness, imagining threats where there were none. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't his imagination. Something was out there, lurking in the shadows. And it was getting closer. He reached for his flashlight, turning the beam over his shoulder and casting a quick sweep behind him. Nothing. But then, in the corner of his eye, he saw it. A fleeting movement, a shadow darting between the trees. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make his heart race. James froze, his breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground. For a long moment there was nothing. The air felt thicker now, the atmosphere heavier. It was as though the forest itself was waiting for something. James swallowed hard, willing himself to move. He needed to get out of there, to find some sign of civilization, to reassure himself that he wasn't losing his mind. But the longer he stood there, the more he felt like a prey animal caught in a hunter's trap. Suddenly, a whisper broke the silence. Soft, almost imperceptible, but distinct. It was a voice, not a human one, though. The sound was guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth, or perhaps from the very trees themselves. It sent a shiver down his spine. The voice seemed to call his name, dragging his mind into a fog. James, it murmured, as though it knew him, knew everything about him. His name echoed in his ears, and he turned again, shining the light in every direction, but there was nothing. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches creaking in response. He wasn't sure if he had imagined it, but the sense of dread deepened. Something was definitely out there, and whatever it wasn't human. Panic surged through him. His pulse raced as he quickened his pace, feet crunching over the underbrush. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. Each step he took seemed to draw him deeper into the forest's grip, as though the trees themselves were pushing him farther down a path he couldn't escape from. It wasn't until he stumbled upon something that he stopped. It was a clearing, but not like any clearing he had seen before. The ground was covered in strange, unnatural markings, scratches, symbols, and deep gouges that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. The air felt charged, almost electric, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. James stepped forward, heart hammering in his chest. Someone had been here before him, and whatever it was had left its mark. James knelt down, his hands trembling as he traced one of the symbols etched into the earth. The markings seemed ancient, like they had been carved into the soil centuries ago, yet they pulsed with a faint, otherworldly glow. He couldn't make sense of the symbols. They weren't from any language he recognized, and they didn't resemble anything in his hiking guide or the survival manuals he had read in preparation for this trip. There was something unsettling about the way the marks seemed to ripple, like they were alive. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as though the voices had gathered just beyond the edge of the clearing, beckoning him closer. His breath hitched in his chest, and his body stiffened with fear. "James," the voice called again, this time with a clarity that sent shivers crawling up his spine. It was unmistakable, not just a whisper, but a low, guttural tone that reverberated in his chest. The sound seemed to surround him, coming from all directions. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something held him in place. Something deeper than fear. Curiosity, perhaps, or an inexplicable pull toward the ritualistic markings that seemed to call to him. He turned his gaze back to the ground, his mind racing as he tried to decipher the meaning behind the symbols. They appeared to form a circle, but not a perfect one. Some lines were broken, jagged, as though something had disrupted the pattern. At the center of the circle, a deep, dark stain marred the earth, as if something large and heavy, had been placed there and left an indelible mark. The air around the stain seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy, crackling with tension. It was almost as if the forest itself held its breath. Suddenly, a rustling noise broke his trance. The sound came from behind him, sharp, urgent, like footsteps crashing through the underbrush. James whipped around, his flashlight beam dancing over the trees. His heart thudded in his chest. For a moment, he saw nothing. But then, just at the edge of his vision, he caught a glimpse of something moving. Something tall, humanoid, but impossibly thin. The shape darted between the trunks, faster than any human could move, vanishing into the darkness. A cold sweat broke out across James's forehead, and he stumbled back, his pulse racing. "Who's there?" he shouted into the void, his voice sounding strangely hollow in the thick silence. No answer. The rustling ceased, but the sense of being watched intensified. He could feel eyes on him, though he couldn't see them. It was as though the very trees themselves were conspiring to trap him, to keep him in this place. His mind raced, and his thoughts became a blur. The forest felt wrong. Everything about it, the shadows, the whispers, the ancient symbols, spoke of something beyond his understanding. His hand gripped the flashlight tighter, and he looked back down at the markings on the ground. What was this place? What had happened here? As if in answer to his unspoken question, the air shifted. The temperature dropped abruptly, the chill biting into his skin. The whispers stopped, and in the silence that followed, James felt a presence behind him. A shadow loomed just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. Slowly, he turned his head, dread creeping up his spine. It was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching him with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. The creature, if it could be called that, was tall, unnaturally tall, and impossibly thin. Its body twisted in a grotesque, almost insect-like way. Its arms hung at its sides, too long for its body, and its skin was a sickly shade of gray, as though it had never seen the sun. The creature didn't move, but its presence was undeniable, suffocating. It was as though the forest had come alive, manifesting a being that existed beyond the natural world. James's mind screamed at him to run, but his feet felt like they were anchored to the ground, frozen in place. The creature didn't approach, but it didn't need to. Its eyes, deep, black, hollow eyes, pierced through him, and for the first time in his life, he understood true fear. Fear not of the unknown, but of something that should never have been. James's breath came in ragged gasps as he locked eyes with the creature. His legs felt numb, as though his body had forgotten how to move. The creature stood still, its eerie eyes staring into his soul, as though it was waiting for something. Its presence radiated a deep, oppressive force that seemed to crush the very air around him. The forest, the symbols, the whispers, they all converged in this moment, and James understood that he was standing on the edge of something far older and darker than he could comprehend. Without thinking, he turned and ran. His legs screamed in protest, but his fear propelled him forward, tearing him through the dense underbrush. The flashlight bounced wildly in his hand as he sprinted down the narrow trail, the path barely visible in the flickering beam of light. Behind him, he could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Too many footsteps, too fast, too close. It was as if the forest itself was giving chase, its very roots rising from the ground to ensnare him. The air grew colder, the chill sinking deep into his bones. His breath formed clouds of vapor that disappeared into the night, swallowed by the darkness. But even as he ran, James couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still there, just beyond the edge of his vision, moving through the trees with an unnatural speed. He didn't dare look back. The path seemed endless, the shadows closing in tighter with each passing second. The forest, once familiar, had become an alien landscape. The trees no longer seemed to stand as silent sentinels, but as active participants in his terror. Their branches twisted like skeletal hands, reaching out to him, and the wind carried strange sounds, whispers, growls, and cries that were not of this world. His mind raced as he pushed himself harder, his breath ragged and desperate. How had this happened? How had he wandered into a place where the rules of reality seemed to break down? Then, just as he thought he couldn't run any longer, the forest opened up before him. He stumbled into a clearing, this one different from the first. Here the ground was barren, the soil cracked and dry, as though nothing had grown there for centuries. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered, covered in moss and lichen. The air around it pulsed with the same oppressive energy that had filled the forest before. It was as though the very earth itself was holding its breath, waiting. James's heart skipped a beat as he realized where he had stumbled. This was the heart of the ritual. The markings on the ground, the whispers in the air, it was all leading him here. The creature had not been chasing him out of malice, but out of necessity. This was the place where the veil between worlds was thinnest, and whatever had been summoned here was tied to the forest, bound by ancient forces James couldn't begin to understand. The creature, whatever it was, had been guarding the secret for millennia, and now James had uncovered it. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled, a low rumble vibrating through his feet. The creature, or whatever it had been, stepped into the clearing, its form now fully illuminated by the moonlight. It was no longer a mere shadow in the trees, but something tangible, something real. Its eyes locked onto James, and for a moment he could hear the whispers again, louder now, coming from the earth itself. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, not in a whisper, but in a low, resonating growl that seemed to shake the very air. The creature took another step forward and the ground cracked beneath its feet. "The forest is not yours to understand," it said, its voice reverberating in James's mind. "You are not meant to leave." James backed away, his legs shaking beneath him. He didn't understand. Was it too late to escape? The creature advanced, its long, that skeletal arms reaching out. It wasn't just a physical presence. It was a manifestation of the forest itself, of everything that had been hidden in the darkness for centuries, and it wanted James to stay. In that moment, James understood the true horror of the wilderness. It was not the forest that was dangerous, nor the creatures that lived within it. It was the knowledge that there were forces, ancient, unknowable forces, that existed beyond human comprehension, waiting for someone to stumble into their domain. And once you did, there was no turning back. The last thing James saw before the darkness swallowed him was the creature's eyes, cold, hollow, and infinite.